After a tense dinner at my son's house, I drove home through a violent storm, still thinking about the strange tea my daughter-in-law had pushed into my hands. Halfway down the empty road, my headlights caught a young woman collapsed near the shoulder, soaked, trembling, and badly injured. When I rushed to her side, she grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Please, don't let them find me." I brought her home, hid her upstairs, and tried to keep her alive through the night. But the next morning, the local police knocked on my door. I froze when I heard them say, "Thank you for being here, truly. Now tell me something before we go further. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country below." I read every single one. One thing to know, some elements of this story were shaped for storytelling purposes. Names and locations are not drawn from any specific source. But what this story says about family trust and betrayal, that part, is as honest as I can make it. The dinner table had never felt so wide. I sat at my usual end, the one closest to the kitchen window, and stared at the chair across from me. Joyce's chair. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Since she last pulled it out, smoothed her apron against her thighs, and sat down with that small, satisfied sigh she always made when a meal came together just right. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. And I still set 2 placemats every evening out of pure muscle memory. I only noticed what I'd done when I looked up and saw her plate sitting there empty and waiting, like it expected her to walk through the door any minute. I pressed my fork into the corner of my mashed potatoes and told myself to eat. Outside the kitchen window, Millhaven was disappearing under the first serious snowfall of December. The kind of snow that didn't ask permission. It came down thick and quiet, swallowing the old oak at the edge of the yard, burying the flower bed Joyce had planted the spring before her diagnosis. She'd chosen black-eyed Susans that year, said they were stubborn flowers, said they'd come back no matter what the winter did to them. I was still waiting to see if she was right. The house felt the way old houses do when they've gone too long, without enough people in them. The radiator knocked and hissed in the hallway. The floorboards above my head creaked as the cold settled into the wood. 41 years I'd lived inside these walls, and I knew every sound this place made the way I knew the sound of my own breathing. But knowing a sound and finding it comfortable were two different things. I set my fork down and looked at the phone on the counter. Colin hadn't called in 11 days. Before that, it had been 2 weeks. I wasn't counting to be bitter about it. I was counting because that's what engineers do when something doesn't add up. We track the data. We look for the pattern. And the pattern I was seeing with my only son told me something had shifted in a way I didn't yet have the language to describe. He was 41 years old. He had a good job managing inventory logistics for a distribution center over in Burlington. He had a house with a 2-car garage and a wife named Renee, who made a point of correcting the way I said her name at Thanksgiving. Ren, A-Y, not Ren-E-E. I'd said it right the first time, then gotten it wrong every time, after just to watch her jaw tighten. That wasn't kind of me. Joyce would have told me so. I pushed back from the table, carried my plate to the sink, and stood there looking out the window at the snow. There was a time not long after Joyce passed when Colin had come by almost every Sunday. He'd sit in his mother's chair without thinking about it, the way children occupy their parents' spaces without realizing what they're doing, and we'd watch football and argue about whether the Patriots still had another championship run in them. Those Sundays had felt like something. Not enough, but something. Then Renee started coming with him, and then Colin started coming less. And then somehow, he stopped coming at all. I picked up the dish towel, dried my hands, and made a decision. I was not the kind of man who waited for the mountain to come to him. I had built this house with a lumber budget, a set of blueprints I drew myself, and 40 weekends of work that left my hands so cracked and raw that Joyce used to rub petroleum jelly into my knuckles every night before bed. I had rebuilt the engine of a 1974 Ford pickup in my driveway when I was 26 years old and didn't fully know what I was doing. I had raised a boy on my own after Joyce got sick the first time, working double shifts at the engineering firm while still making it home in time to help with homework. I was not a man who sat and waited. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, the heavy canvas Carhartt I'd owned for 15 years, and pushed my arms through the sleeves. My knees ached the way they always did in cold weather, a deep grinding complaint that my doctor called the natural consequence of too many years on the concrete floors. I called it inconvenient. There was a difference. The truck started on the second try, which was better than last winter. I let it idle for a few minutes, watching the defroster slowly eat a clear patch into the frost on the windshield, and I thought about what I was going to say when Colin opened the door. I hadn't told him I was coming. If I had, there would have been a reason he was busy. There always was lately. The roads through Millhaven were quiet, the way small Vermont towns go quiet in December, like the whole place exhales and decides to wait out the dark months with as little fuss as possible. I'd lived here for over 4 decades since Joyce and I drove up from Connecticut with everything we owned in the back of a rented truck, and fell in love with a piece of land on the edge of town that nobody else seemed to want. People here knew each other. They nodded at the hardware store. They brought casseroles when someone died. They left you alone when you needed it and showed up when you didn't know you needed them. It was a good place. I had never once regretted choosing it. Colin's house was on Birchwood Drive, a newer development on the south side of town, where the lots were smaller and the houses all looked like they'd been designed by the same person on the same afternoon. I pulled up to the curb and cut the engine. The lights were on inside. Through the front window, I could see the blue flicker of a television, and in the kitchen, a figure moving behind the glass. Renee. She was standing at the counter with her back to the window, her dark hair pulled up tight, her movements precise and efficient in the way of someone who treated every domestic task like a project to be completed on schedule. I watched her for a moment longer than I probably should have, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not suspicion, not yet. Just a vague unease like a sound at the edge of hearing that you can't quite identify. I reached for the door handle. Whatever was waiting for me inside that house, I was going to walk toward it. That was the only way I'd ever known how to live. I stepped out into the snow, turned up my collar against the wind coming down off the mountains, and walked up the front path toward the light. Colin opened the door on the second knock, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know before either of us said a word. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even the mild, tired warmth of a son who was happy to see his father, but too exhausted to show it properly. It was something closer to panic, quickly swallowed, quickly replaced by a smile that didn't come from anywhere real. His eyes darted past my shoulder toward the street, then back to my face, and I watched him make a decision in the space of half a second. "Dad?" He stepped back from the door. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's why I didn't call." He let out a short laugh that had no humor in it and ran a hand through his hair. Colin had always been a thin man, built like his mother's side of the family, long and angular, with a face that showed everything he felt whether he wanted it to or not. Right now, his face was showing me something he very much did not want me to see. His shoulders were pulled up tight toward his ears, and there was a tension around his jaw that made him look 10 years older than 41. "Come in," he said. We were just finishing dinner. The house smelled like roasted chicken and something else underneath it, something sharp and chemical that I couldn't immediately name, and filed away without comment. The living room was neat in a way that felt enforced rather than natural. No books left open on the coffee table, no throw blanket draped carelessly over the arm of the couch. Everything in its exact right place, like a showroom where no one actually lived. Renee was already standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room when I came in. She had changed out of whatever she'd been wearing earlier into a dark blouse that looked more like armor than clothing, and her smile was the kind that arrives fully assembled, every tooth accounted for, no feeling required. "Walter," she said. What a surprise. The way she said surprise made it clear it was not a pleasant one. "Renee," I nodded. "Sorry to drop in like this. I was in the neighborhood." "You live 12 minutes away," she said, still smiling. "You're always in the neighborhood." Colin made a sound in his throat that might have been a laugh and moved past her toward the dining table. "Sit down, Dad. You hungry? There's chicken left." "I ate already. I'll sit with you, though." The dining table was a heavy farmhouse style that Renee had picked out, I knew, because Colin had told me about the argument they'd had over the price. She won that argument the way she seemed to win most of them. I pulled out the chair at the end farthest from her and settled in, and I looked at my son. He was staring at his plate. The food on it had barely been touched. "How have you been, Colin?" I asked. "I haven't heard from you in a while." "Busy," he said, pushing a piece of chicken to the edge of his plate. "Work's been crazy. You know how it gets in December, everyone trying to hit their year-end numbers." "Sure," I said. "I remember that." Renee reached across the table and refilled her water glass without being asked. "Walter, I've been meaning to talk to you about something, actually." Her voice had shifted into a register. I recognized the one she used when she'd been rehearsing. "Colin and I have been a little worried about you lately, living alone in that big house all the way up on Henderson Road." I looked at her. "Is that right?" You've seemed a little forgetful lately. At Thanksgiving, you told the same story about your old firm twice in 20 minutes. And last month, Colin mentioned you left the garage door open overnight. Colin's fork scraped against his plate. He didn't look up. The garage door has a broken sensor, I said. I'm waiting on the part. Of course, Renee said smoothly. I'm just saying it might be worth thinking about your options. There's a lovely place over in Stowe that has independent living units. Very comfortable, very safe. You'd have people around you. I felt my back teeth come together. I kept my voice even. I have people around me. I have Frank Delano next door. I have Patricia Owens down the road. I have my son. I looked at Colin when I said the last part. He was still looking at his plate, his jaw working, his hand gripping his fork so hard his knuckles had gone pale. Renee smiled. Well, something to think about. She stood up and began collecting plates. Colin, can you get the rest? Colin stood immediately like a man who had been waiting for the instruction. As he passed behind Renee's chair, I saw it. Her hand reached out and caught his wrist, not gently. Her fingers wrapped around it and pressed, and Colin went still for just a half second, his shoulders dropping something behind his eyes, going flat and obedient. Then she let go, and he continued into the kitchen. My stomach turned over. I had spent 40 years as a structural engineer. My entire profession was built on the ability to look at a system, identify every point of stress, and determine which ones would fail first under pressure. What I had just watched was not a marriage. It was a load-bearing arrangement, and every ounce of the weight was resting on one person. 20 minutes later, I stood at the front door with my coat on. Renee appeared from the kitchen, carrying a small mason jar with a cloth lid tied around the top with a piece of twine. Before you go, she said, holding it out toward me, I made this for you. It's an herbal blend. Chamomile, valerian root, a few other things. Colin mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping. I took the jar. It was warm against my palm. That's thoughtful of you. Just steep it for about 5 minutes before bed. She patted my arm with a touch so light it barely registered. Take care of yourself, Walter. Colin was standing just behind her. He raised his hand in something that might have been a wave, and his mouth moved, and I think he was trying to say goodnight, but what came out was barely more than a breath. I drove 3 miles toward home before I pulled over. Something about that jar was wrong. I knew it the way I knew when a blueprint had an error before I could identify exactly where it was. The feeling lived in the body first before the mind caught up. My hand was resting on the jar in the cup holder, and I made myself think it through, the way I would approach any problem. What did I actually know? I knew the tea smelled slightly off. I knew the valerian root had a distinctive earthy bitterness that I recognized from years of Joyce drinking it, and this was something else under that. Something sharper, something that didn't belong. I reached into my coat pocket and found what I was looking for. A small glass spice jar I'd emptied that morning, washed clean lid screwed on tight. I always carried one in my right pocket during the winter months to collect soil samples when I spotted interesting erosion patterns on my walks. Joyce used to shake her head at that habit, called me the only retired engineer in Vermont who treated the outdoors like a laboratory. My hands moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent his career not making mistakes that mattered. I poured most of the tea into the small jar, screwed the lid tight, and tucked it back into my pocket. Then I started the truck again and pulled back onto the road. By the time I reached the junction at Route 108, the first wave hit me. A slow, soft heaviness behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. The road lights ahead stretched and smeared at the edges, and I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and focused on the center line. One sip. I'd only had one sip. I pressed the heater up higher and talked myself through the miles. You know this road. You've driven it 10,000 times. Pay attention to the curve at the bottom of Henderson Hill. Watch for deer at the tree line past Miller's farm. I made it home. I sat in the driveway for a long time before I trusted my legs to carry me inside, my forehead resting against the cold of the steering wheel, the little glass jar pressing against my ribs through the fabric of my coat. Outside, the snow kept falling slow and indifferent, covering everything equally. I don't know how long I sat in that driveway. Long enough for the engine to cool and the cab to go cold around me. Long enough for the snow to build a thin white line along the bottom edge of the windshield. My forehead was still resting against the steering wheel, and every time I lifted my head and tried to focus on the garage door 20 feet in front of me, the edges of it softened and swam like a reflection in disturbed water. One sip. I had taken one sip of that tea. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and made myself think clearly. Whatever was in that jar, it had moved fast. Faster than chamomile, faster than valerian root. I had consumed maybe 2 tablespoons of liquid, and within 40 minutes, I was having trouble reading a road I had driven 10,000 times. That was not an herb. That was something else entirely. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small glass jar still there, lid tight safe. Then I started the truck again, turned the heat all the way up, and drove. The storm had worsened while I sat in Colin's driveway feeling sorry for myself. The wind had picked up out of the northwest, the way Vermont storms do when they mean business, driving the snow sideways across the beam of my headlights so that the road ahead looked like television static. I kept my speed down and both hands on the wheel and talked myself through the turns I knew, by feel more than by sight. Henderson Road climbed for about a mile after the junction, before it leveled off and ran along the ridge above the tree line. On a clear night, you could see the lights of the valley from up there. Tonight there was nothing but white and dark. I was 3/4 of the way up the ridge when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer, a shape at the edge of my headlight range, low and irregular, moving wrong. I eased off the gas and leaned forward against the wheel, squinting through the snow. Not a deer. The movement was too slow, too deliberate, the kind of movement that costs something to produce. A person. I brought the truck to a stop on the shoulder and sat there for 2 full seconds with my foot on the brake. Everything I knew about common sense and self-preservation told me to keep driving. It was nearly midnight. The storm was bad enough that nobody with good intentions would be out on foot on Henderson Road. I had something in my system that was making the edges of my vision unreliable. I was 72 years old, with bad knees, and a heart that my cardiologist described as enthusiastic but aging. Then I thought about Joyce. She used to say that the test of a person's character wasn't what they did when it was easy. It was what they did at midnight in a snowstorm, when they were tired and scared and nobody was watching. I put the truck in park and got out. The cold hit me like a wall. The wind tore at the collar of my coat and pushed hard against my chest as I walked toward the shape on the ground, and I had to lean into it to make progress. My boots found purchase on the frozen gravel at the road's edge, and I moved carefully, watching the ground, and when I was close enough to see clearly, my heart seized in my chest. It was a young woman. She was lying half on the road and half on the gravel shoulder, her legs at an angle that told me she hadn't chosen to be there. She was wearing a dark jacket that was torn badly at the left shoulder, and her hair was matted against the side of her face with snow and something darker. Her chest was moving, barely, but moving. I dropped to one knee beside her, my joints screaming in protest, and put 2 fingers against the side of her throat. Her pulse was there, rapid and thin, but there. "Hey!" I put my hand on her shoulder, the right one away from the torn jacket. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. They were dark and glassy with shock, but behind the shock, something sharp and desperate was fighting to stay present. "Don't!" Her voice came out cracked and barely above a whisper. "Don't let them find me. They're going to—" She stopped. Her whole body shuddered, a deep convulsive tremor that went all the way through her. "They're going to kill me. Nobody's going to find you on this road tonight," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands had started to shake. "I need you to stay awake. Can you do that?" I already had my phone out. I dialed 911 and held it to my ear and got 3 seconds of static before the call dropped. Tried again. Dropped again. The storm had taken out the cell coverage on the ridge the way it did every bad winter, a fact I knew and had not thought about until this exact moment when it mattered most. I looked down the road in both directions. To my left, Henderson Road dropped back toward town, but the lower section ran along the base of the ridge where the runoff came down, and in a storm like this, the drainage ditches overflowed onto the pavement. I had seen it close that road twice in the past decade. To my right was the way home, and my house, and the landline I still kept, because Joyce had insisted on it. The nearest urgent care clinic was 11 miles south in Waterbury. In these conditions on these roads, that was 40 minutes minimum, maybe more. I looked at the woman on the ground. She was trying to push herself upright and failing, her right arm buckling under her, a sound coming from her chest with each breath that I did not like at all. "Don't move," I said. "You've got at least 1 broken rib. Moving wrong will make it worse." She looked up at me, and through the shock and the pain, her eyes focused on my face with an intensity that caught me off guard. "Who are you?" "Walter Greer. I live up the road. I'm going to get you into my truck." "You don't know me," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear in it the specific terror of someone who had learned recently that strangers could not be trusted. "No," I said. "I don't, but you're hurt and it's below 20 degrees and my knees are already killing me from crouching down here, so let's have this conversation in the truck." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but close. Getting her upright was harder than I had expected, and easier than I had feared. She was lighter than she should have been, and she bit down hard on whatever sound she wanted to make when I got my arm under hers and we came up together. I felt her whole body go rigid with the effort of not crying out, every muscle locked against the pain, and it took everything I had to keep us both moving toward the truck. She made a sound that might have been an attempt at a word and then stopped. Her eyes were losing focus. "Nora," she said finally, with the careful deliberateness of someone fighting to hold on to something essential. "My name is Nora Ellison." "Okay, Nora," I said. "Keep walking." I got her into the back seat and pulled a wool blanket from behind the passenger seat, one I kept there out of a habit Joyce had drilled into me decades ago. Always carry a blanket in a Vermont winter, Walter. You'll feel foolish until the one day you don't. I tucked it around Nora Ellison's shoulders, and she grabbed the edge of it with both hands and pulled it tight, and her eyes found mine over the top of it. "Thank you," she said. The words came out broken like they had been waiting somewhere painful. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "We've got a long night ahead." I climbed back into the driver's seat and pulled a careful 3-point turn on the narrow road. My headlights swept across the tree line, across the empty dark of the road, behind us across the place where I had found her. No other lights, no other cars, just the storm and the trees and the long white silence of a Vermont mountain in December. I drove toward home, with both hands on the wheel and one eye on the rearview mirror, watching the woman in my back seat breathe. By the time we reached the house, she was unconscious again. I sat in the driveway for a moment, looking at the dark windows of my home, and I thought about Joyce's chair and the empty plate I'd set out of habit and how the house had felt hollow all evening. Then I got out of the truck and went around to the back door and started figuring out how to get Nora Ellison inside without making her broken ribs any worse. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing. The storm was settling into the long, quiet work of covering everything it could reach before morning came. I had not slept. I told myself I was keeping watch, which was partly true. The other part was that every time I closed my eyes, the road on Henderson Ridge came back to me, that shape moving wrong in the headlights, and I'd jerk awake with my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to get out. By 4 a.m, I gave up pretending and went downstairs to make coffee. I had done what I could for Nora Ellison. The torn jacket had come off easily enough once she was conscious and cooperative, which she'd been for about 20 minutes before the exhaustion pulled her back under. 2 cracked ribs on the left side, from what I could tell without an x-ray. A deep bruise along her left hip that had already gone purple and ugly. Scrapes on both palms from catching herself on the frozen road. I'd wrapped her ribs with the ace bandages I kept in the first aid kit in the bathroom closet, given her 2 ibuprofen and a glass of water, and helped her up the narrow stairs to the room on the 3rd floor. Joyce's sewing room, the one with the low ceiling and the window that looked out over the backyard and the mountain beyond it. I hadn't been up there in months. It still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Joyce kept in the dresser drawers. I'd left a glass of water and the ibuprofen bottle on the nightstand, told Nora I'd be downstairs if she needed anything, and gone back down to sit in the dark with my thoughts and a glass of bourbon I didn't finish. Now it was 6:47 in the morning, and the coffee was done, and the television was on, and the world was about to get considerably more complicated. I was standing at the kitchen counter with my mug halfway to my mouth when the news anchor's voice changed register, that specific shift they make when they're transitioning to something they consider urgent, and I set the mug down very carefully on the counter. A photograph filled the screen. It was a work ID photo, the kind taken against a gray background under fluorescent lights, the kind nobody ever looks good in. But even through the flatness of it, I could see the dark eyes, and the sharp cheekbones, and the set of the jaw that I recognized from the night before. The anchor's voice came through clearly over the kitchen noise. Vermont State Police are asking for the public's assistance in locating Nora Ellison, 29, a staff accountant at Millhaven Capital, partners a regional financial services firm based in Millhaven. Ellison is believed to have been involved in a single-vehicle accident on Route 108 late Thursday evening and fled the scene. She is also alleged to have removed confidential proprietary documents from the company's offices prior to her disappearance. Anyone with information regarding her whereabouts is asked to contact. I turned the television off. I stood in my kitchen in the early morning, quiet, and listened to the sound of the house settling around me, and thought about the jar in my coat pocket and the woman sleeping 2 floors above my head, and the way this day had been 12 hours ago, simply a Tuesday in December when I planned to eat dinner alone and go to bed early. I picked up my coffee and went upstairs. I knocked twice on the sewing room door before I opened it. Nora was awake. She was sitting up against the headboard with the blanket pulled to her chin, and when the door opened, her whole body went rigid and her eyes went wide, and she pulled in a sharp breath that made her wince hard from the ribs. "It's just me," I said. "Walter." She let the breath out slowly, and I watched her force her shoulders back down from around her ears. Her face was pale against the dark of her hair, and there were shadows under her eyes deep enough to have been painted on. But her gaze was clear and focused in a way it hadn't been the night before, and I could see her reading me the same way I was reading her. "There's a news report," I said. I didn't see any point in softening it. "Your name and your photograph. They're saying you were in an accident on Route 108 and left the scene. They're also saying you took documents from your employer." Something moved across her face, not surprise. Something more like the grim recognition of a person who had been waiting for a specific bad thing to happen and was now watching it arrive on schedule. Her hands tightened on the edge of the blanket until her knuckles went white. "I didn't cause any accident," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it cost her. "I was run off the road. There's a difference." "I'm listening," I said. I pulled the small wooden chair from the corner and sat down. "But I need you to understand something first. I am 72 years old. I live alone. I have a son who barely speaks to me, and a coat pocket full of tea that I believe someone put something into that shouldn't be there. I am not in a position to take on problems I don't understand. So, if you want to stay in this room, I need the truth. All of it. Starting now." Nora Ellison looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her making a calculation, the same kind of calculation I'd been making since I found her on the road. How much to trust? How much to risk? Where the line was between necessary faith and fatal naivety. Then she reached under the pillow and pulled out her phone. "Read these," she said, and held it out to me. I took it. The screen showed a message thread with a number listed only as unknown. I scrolled up to find the beginning and read from the top. The first message was 3 weeks old. It read, "We know what you found. Put it back and walk away." The second 2 days later, "Last warning. Return the files or we make sure you can't talk to anyone." The third 1 week ago, "You had your chance. Now, we finish this our way." The fourth was from yesterday afternoon, time-stamped 4 hours before I had found her on the road tonight. My chest tightened. I handed the phone back without saying anything immediately, because I needed a moment to make sure what I was about to say came out level and useful, rather than the other thing it wanted to be. "Who sent these?" I asked. "I don't know the number," she said. "It's a burner, unregistered, but I know where the order came from." She paused and I could see her deciding how far to go. "I'm an accountant. I've been at Millhaven Capital for 3 years. 8 months ago, I started noticing discrepancies in the vendor payment records, small ones at first. The kind that could be rounding errors or data entry mistakes. But they kept appearing in the same pattern, always the same vendor codes, always routed through the same approval chain." She stopped and pressed her lips together. "Someone has been systematically pulling money out of client accounts for at least 18 months. I have the documentation. I've been building the file for 6 weeks. And someone found out you were building it," I said. "Someone found out," she said. "And instead of firing me or threatening me through normal channels, they decided to make me disappear and make it look like I was the one stealing." Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment before she continued. "I've spent 3 years of my life at that company. I did everything right. I followed every rule. And now my face is on the morning news, and I'm sitting in a stranger's attic with 2 broken ribs because I made the mistake of being honest." Her eyes had gone bright and wet, and I could see her fighting at jaw-tight throat, working determined not to come apart in front of a man she'd known for 6 hours. I looked at the phone in her hand. Then I looked at the coat hanging on the back of the door, the one with the small glass jar in the pocket. "I'm not saying I believe everything you've told me," I said carefully. "But I'm not saying I don't either. What I am saying is that I have my own reasons to think that something dishonest has been happening in this town, and that it involves some of the same people you're describing." I stood up and pushed the chair back toward the corner. I'm going to make you some breakfast. Real breakfast, not tea. And then we're going to think this through like adults. Nora Ellison stared at me. Then slowly something in her expression shifted, some long-held tension, releasing like a knot finally worked loose, and her eyes spilled over, despite everything she'd done to prevent it. She wiped her face quickly with the back of her wrist, almost angry about it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't know me." I thought about Joyce, about a woman who had once pulled over on a 89 in a rainstorm to help a family with a blown tire, who had brought soup to neighbors she barely knew, who had told me more times than I could count, that the measure of a life wasn't what you built, but what you chose to do when it cost you something. "Let's just say I was raised right," I said, "and I'm still trying to live up to it." I went back downstairs, and I was halfway through cracking eggs into a pan when the knock at the front door came. 3 sharp official knocks that I recognized immediately as belonging to a person with a badge. My hand stopped moving over the pan. I set the egg down on the counter, wiped my hands on the dish towel, took one slow breath. Then I went to answer the door. Dale Morrow had been the sheriff of Lamoille County for 19 years, and he had the kind of face that went with the job. Broad and weathered, with a jaw that looked like it had been poured from concrete and left to cure in the cold. He was not an unkind man. I had known him well enough to wave to, for 2 decades had shaken his hand at the 4th of July parade every summer, had once helped him push his cruiser out of a ditch on Maple Street during an ice storm back in 2019. But right now, he was standing on my front porch in full uniform, with his hat in his hands and an expression that told me this was not a social call. "Walter," he said, "sorry to bother you this early." "Dale." I stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold." He came in ducking slightly out of habit, even though the door frame was tall enough, and stood in the entryway looking around, the way cops do, not suspicious exactly, just always taking inventory. His boots left 2 wet prints on the mat. "Coffee?" I asked. "No thank you. I won't be long." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "Walter. I was out on Henderson Road this morning doing a sweep. Storm brought down some branches across the pavement up near the ridge. While I was up there, I noticed some tire tracks in the mud on the shoulder, right around mile marker 7. He looked at me steadily. "Looked like someone pulled over and spent some time there. Tracks match a truck. Your truck, if I had to guess, based on the tread width." I held his gaze without any difficulty, because I had nothing in my expression worth hiding. That was the advantage of telling partial truths. "I pulled over up there last night," I said. "Thought I saw something in the road. Turned out to be a branch. With the medication I'm on for my blood pressure, driving in bad weather at night makes me cautious." I sat for a few minutes until I felt steady, then came home. Morrow nodded slowly. "See anything else up there? Anything unusual?" "Snow," I said. "Wind. The usual Henderson Road experience in December." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. He knew that road. Everyone in Millhaven knew that road. "You hear about that situation over in town? Young woman works at the financial company on Main Street." "Saw something on the news this morning," I said. "Didn't catch all of it." "We're just doing a sweep of the area," he said. "She was last seen heading north on 108. Henderson Road connects up that way." He looked at me again, and I met it, and after a moment he seemed satisfied with whatever he found there. "You doing all right, Walter? Living up here alone through the winter?" "I'm doing fine, Dale. Thank you for asking." He nodded, put his hat back on, and I walked him to the door. The whole thing had taken maybe 6 minutes. I stood on the porch and watched his cruiser back out of the driveway and turn south toward town, and I waited until the sound of his engine faded completely before I let myself breathe properly. I went back inside and stood at the kitchen sink, both hands flat on the counter, looking out the window at the snow-covered yard. That had been close, not because Morrow suspected anything specific, but because men like Dale Morrow were good at accumulating small details until they added up to something larger. I had bought time, not safety. I was still standing there when I heard the second car. I turned and looked out the front window and felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Colin's dark blue Subaru was pulling into my driveway, and before it had fully stopped, Renee was already opening the passenger door. They had seen Morrow's cruiser. Had to have. His was the only law enforcement vehicle in Lamoille County with that specific dent in the rear panel from the 2021 incident on Route 15, and anyone in Millhaven who paid attention knew it on sight. They had been nearby, had seen it parked at my house, and had come to investigate. I moved quickly but without rushing, which was a distinction that mattered. I stepped from the kitchen into the small mudroom that connected to the back door, crouched down and used a dish towel to wipe up the faint scuff marks and the trace of dried mud near the base of the stairs that I'd been meaning to clean since last night. I kicked the dish towel behind the washing machine, straightened up, and was back at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug in my hand by the time the front door opened. Colin came in first. He was wearing his work coat, the one with the Carhartt logo that I had given him 3 Christmases ago, and his face had that compressed, anxious look I had been seeing more and more of lately, like a man who was perpetually braced for something to go wrong. "Dad." He came across the kitchen and put his hand briefly on my shoulder. His fingers were tense. "We saw Dale's car. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said. He was doing a sweep of Henderson Road, storm damage. Renee came in behind him. She was wearing a cream-colored wool coat that cost more than my monthly utility bill and carrying a paper bag from Millhaven Bakery. She set it on the counter and turned to me with an expression so pleasant it had no edges. "We brought breakfast," she said. "I know you never eat properly in the morning, Walter. Colin worries." "That's thoughtful," I said. She moved into the kitchen, the way water moves into a space filling it, finding every corner. She opened the bakery bag, took out a wax paper sleeve, set it on the counter. Then she turned and looked at the kitchen, with the particular attention of someone who was not looking at the kitchen. Colin sat down at the table. He was rubbing the back of his neck with one hand, his eyes moving from me to the window to the door and back again, unable to settle anywhere. "Dad," he said, "you really should think about getting one of those medical alert systems. For when you're driving at night in weather like Colin." I said his name quietly, but with enough weight that he stopped. "I drove home from your house last night in a storm, same as I've driven home from your house in a storm 100 times before. I'm fine." He nodded, but his jaw was tight, and I could see something working behind his eyes that I didn't have a name for yet. Renee had moved to the far end of the kitchen counter near the refrigerator and was opening and closing cabinet doors with the cheerful efficiency of someone just putting things away. I watched her from my peripheral vision, the way I used to watch structural anomalies during site inspections. You didn't stare directly. You noted, you tracked. Her hand paused near the gap under the kitchen table, just for a moment, a fraction of a second. Her fingers hovered, and then she straightened up and closed the last cabinet door and turned back to me with that assembled smile, and I knew with the certainty of a man who had spent 40 years reading the stress points in things that were supposed to hold that she had seen something. "Bless your heart, Walter, this kitchen." She clicked her tongue softly. "You know what, I should come by one afternoon this week and give it a proper clean. Colin can help. We'll make a day of it." Before I could respond, Colin's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and stood up with the sudden movement of someone who'd been given a reason to move. "I have to take this," he said, already heading for the living room. "It's work." Renee watched him go. Then she looked at me, and for just a moment, just a single unguarded second, the assembled smile was somewhere else. And what was underneath it was something I had no interest in being alone in a room with. Then the pleasantness returned, smooth and immediate, like a door closing on something she did not want seen. "You take care of yourself, Walter," she said. She picked up her coat from the chair. "We worry about you up here alone." I walked them to the door. I watched the Subaru back out. I watched it until it was gone. Then I leaned against the closed door and pressed my hand flat against my sternum, feeling my heart knock against my palm like it was trying to tell me something I already knew. She had seen something under that table. I didn't know what. But Renee Greer had come into my house this morning with a smile like a closed fist, and she had left it knowing more than she arrived with. I went to the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. Then a voice I had trusted for 40 years said, "This better be good, Walter. It's 7:30 in the morning." "Frank," I said, "I need you. Today." A pause. Then, "Give me 2 hours." Frank Delano had spent 22 years as a licensed private investigator in Vermont before he retired to the house next door to mine. He never talked about the work unless it was relevant, and it had never been relevant until now. Frank Delano pulled up at 9:47 in a white van with Millhaven Plumbing and Repair stenciled on the side in blue letters, and I had to admit that even knowing it was coming, even having arranged the whole thing myself, the sight of it still made me feel marginally better about the world. Frank had owned that van for 11 years. He had repainted the logo twice, changed the phone number on the side, once after a dispute with the actual plumbing company, whose name was one word off from his, and kept it registered and insured on the grounds that you never knew when you might need to be invisible in plain sight. I watched from the kitchen window as he climbed out. He was a big man, Frank, the kind of big that doesn't come from a gym, but from decades of physical work, with hands like a pair of catcher's mitts, and a face that had been rearranged once or twice over the years. He was wearing a gray work shirt with a patch on the chest pocket that said Dale, which was not his name, but was the name of the actual plumber whose van he had borrowed the design from. He pulled his toolbox from the back, settled his cap low over his forehead, and walked to my front door with the unhurried authority of a man who fixed things for a living, and had absolutely no reason to be nervous about it. I opened the door before he could knock. The pipe's been acting up in the downstairs bathroom, I said loud enough to carry to any neighbor who might be paying attention, though my nearest neighbor was 300 yards down the road, and unlikely to be standing in the cold monitoring my visitor situation. "Yeah, you mentioned," Frank said in a voice 2 registers lower than his normal one. He stepped inside, set the toolbox down, and the moment the door closed behind him, he straightened up and looked at me with his actual face, which was somewhere between concerned and deeply annoyed. "Walter," he said in his real voice, "what in the name of Vermont have you gotten yourself into?" "I'll explain upstairs," I said. "Come meet someone first." Frank followed me up to the sewing room, toolbox in hand, and when I opened the door, and he got his first look at Nora Ellison sitting up against the headboard with her jaw set, and her dark eyes measuring him, the way you measure something you're not sure you can trust. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "Frank Delano," he said. "Retired. Don't worry. I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself until I've taken a look at those ribs." Nora blinked. "You're a doctor?" "No. But I've wrapped enough field injuries to know the difference between bruised and broken, and either way, the protocol is the same." He set the toolbox on the floor, opened it, and produced a proper first aid kit from under the plumbing supplies. "Walter, go make coffee. This'll take 10 minutes. I went back downstairs and made the coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard and thinking about the small glass jar in my coat pocket. The snow had stopped overnight, and the yard was white and still, and the mountains beyond it were the particular shade of blue-gray that Vermont mornings get in December, when the clouds are high and thin. Joyce had loved that color, had tried to paint it once on a canvas she kept in the sewing room, the same room where Nora was sleeping. She never finished it. The canvas was still up there leaning against the wall behind the dresser. Frank came downstairs 12 minutes later and poured himself a coffee without asking, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. "2 cracked ribs on the left side," he said. "She needs a proper x-ray, but she's not in danger. I rewrapped her. She should stay horizontal as much as possible for the next few days." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "She told me her version while I was working. Accountant Millhaven Capital found something in the books, got threatened, got run off the road." He looked at me steadily. "You believe her?" "I believe the texts on her phone," I said. "And I believe my own experience of the last 12 hours. I got up and retrieved my coat from the hook and came back to the table. I set the small glass jar down between us. Frank picked it up, turned it in his hands, held it up to the window light. He opened the lid and brought it close to his nose and breathed in carefully the way a man does when he's looking for something specific rather than just smelling. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Renee gave it to me last night," I said. "Called it herbal tea. For my insomnia." Frank put the lid back on the jar, slowly. He set it down on the table and looked at it for a long moment without touching it again, and the expression on his face made something tighten in my stomach. "I know a woman over in Burlington who runs a private toxicology lab," he said. "She does work for defense attorneys mostly. Discreet fast, and she owes me 2 favors from a case I helped her with in 2018. He looked up at me. "I'll drive it over this afternoon." "I'd appreciate that," I said. He nodded, then he pulled out his own phone and set it on the table face up, and looked at me with an expression I recognized from 40 years of friendship as the one that preceded something I was not going to enjoy hearing. While I was upstairs with the girl, he said, "I made a couple of calls, used some old contacts. I wanted to check the background on Millhaven Capital before I walked in here without knowing what I was walking into." He paused. "Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it before you react." "Go ahead," I said. "How long has Renee been involved in your finances? Any joint accounts, any power of attorney discussions, anything like that?" I felt the question land somewhere uncomfortable. None of that. She's my daughter-in-law. She has no access to my accounts. Has Colin ever asked you about your will, your property value, the retirement accounts? My jaw tightened. Frank, I know, he said. Just answer it. I thought about it carefully, the way I thought about structural calculations, removing emotion from the equation and looking only at what was actually there. Renee brought up the house value twice. Once at dinner about 8 months ago, once on the phone with Colin that I overheard by accident 3 months back. I didn't think much of it at the time. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I found something in the public court records this morning, a filing with the Lemoyle County Probate Court submitted 6 weeks ago. He picked up his phone and turned it to face me, showing me a scanned document on the screen. You know what a conservatorship petition is, Walter? I knew what it was. I had known what it was since 1987, when I helped a colleague navigate the process for his mother after her stroke. A conservatorship under Vermont law was a legal arrangement in which a court declared that a person was no longer capable of managing their own affairs, their finances, their property, their decisions. All of it transferred to a court-appointed guardian. The document on Frank's phone was a petition to the Lemoyle County Probate Court requesting exactly that. The petitioner's name was Colin Greer. The subject of the petition was Walter Greer. I did not reach for the phone. I did not need to see more than Frank had already shown me. I sat at my kitchen table in the house I had built with my own hands and looked at my friend's face and felt something happen in my chest that I could not have described to you if I tried something that was not quite pain and not quite rage, but lived somewhere between the two in a place I had not visited before. There is also this, Frank said, his voice careful now, the way you were careful around something that might break. I cross-referenced Renee's professional history. She has a colleague, a Dr. Gerald Harmon, licensed psychiatrist, private practice over in Stowe. He put the phone down. Walter Harmon's office manager is a woman named Carol Desjardins. I've known Carol for 15 years. Her late husband and I served on the same volunteer fire crew. She confirmed without disclosing protected details that Renee made a cash pay consultation appointment 4 months ago, and that the subject involved a family member's cognitive capacity evaluation. Carol also told me Harmon has done this before, written supporting declarations for conservatorship petitions, based on second-hand accounts, no direct examination. That's a pattern. And patterns leave traces in public records. He looked at me. The supporting declaration Harmon signed is already attached to the court filing. That part is public record. I pulled it this morning. The room felt very still. 4 months ago. Before I had taken a single sip of that tea. Before I had noticed Colin pulling away. Before any of this had broken the surface, Renee had already been sitting in a psychiatrist's office asking how to build a paper record that would hold up in a Vermont courtroom. She planned this, I said. My voice came out level, which surprised me because nothing else inside me was. From the beginning, Frank said. Walter, this wasn't a decision she made in anger or desperation. This was a project. She has been working on this for at least 4 months that we can document. Possibly longer. I put both hands flat on the table. I could feel the wood grain under my palms solid and real, and something to press against. I thought about Renee handing me that jar with her assembled smile and her cool, dry hand on my arm. I thought about Colin sitting at the dinner table last night, staring at food he couldn't eat. Why hasn't she gone to the police about any of this herself? I asked. If she's building a case against me, why not? Because she needs the conservatorship approved before she moves, Frank said. Once that goes through, she controls everything. The house, the accounts, the retirement funds, all of it. Going through the courts protects her legally. Going around them creates risk. He looked at me directly. And right now, Walter, the reason we haven't gone to Sheriff Morrow with what we have is the same reason she hasn't. We don't yet have enough to be certain he won't take it straight to her before we can protect ourselves. We need more. We need the lab results. We need documentation that holds up. He reached across the table and picked up the small glass jar. Give me until tonight, he said. I nodded, and Frank Delano, who had been my friend since we were both young men, who thought we knew how the world worked, picked up his toolbox and his jar of evidence and walked out my back door into the cold Vermont morning. I sat alone in my kitchen and looked at the empty table in front of me. Outside, somewhere on the mountain, a branch cracked under the weight of the snow and fell. Before I show you what was actually inside that jar, and what I found at the bottom of that court document, comment the word Greer right now, so I know you are still with me. Because what comes next changed everything. I thought I knew about my own family, and if you have ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, I think this part is going to hit close to home. One thing worth mentioning, some details in this story have been shaped for narrative purposes and may not reflect any specific events. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, this is a good moment to step away. But if you are staying, I promise it is worth it. Frank sent the email at 6:17 the following morning. I had been awake since 4, sitting at my desk in the small room off the hallway that I had used as a home office since the year Colin started high school. The desk was the same one I had bought secondhand from a colleague who was moving to Portland, a solid oak thing, with 3 drawers on the right side and a surface large enough to spread out a full set of blueprints. I had spent 30 years of my career at desks like this, one reading documents that told me the truth about structures that other people had built and wanted me to validate or condemn. I had always been good at reading documents. When the email arrived, I opened it immediately and read it the way I read everything that mattered, slowly from the beginning, without skipping ahead to the conclusion, because the details were always where the truth actually lived. The subject line said, "Results. Call me when you've read this." The body of the email was a forwarded lab report from a woman named Dr. Sandra Cole at Burlington Analytical Services. The report was 4 pages long and written in the precise, effectless language of forensic chemistry, and I read every word of it twice. The sample contained 2 compounds that did not belong in any herbal tea. The first was clonazepam. It is a benzodiazepine, a class of drug used legitimately to treat seizure disorders and severe anxiety. In therapeutic doses prescribed by a physician and taken under supervision, it is a controlled but manageable medication. In the concentration present in my sample, which Dr. Cole described as approximately 4 times the standard therapeutic dose, it would cause significant sedation, memory disruption, and confusion within 30 to 60 minutes of ingestion. Taken daily over a period of weeks, it would produce symptoms that a non-specialist observer would find difficult to distinguish from the early stages of dementia: impaired short-term memory, difficulty with complex reasoning, episodes of disorientation. The second compound was scopolamine. It is used in small doses for motion sickness and post-surgical nausea. In higher concentrations, it has a darker history. It impairs the formation of new memories and increases suggestibility. Combined with the clonazepam, Dr. Cole wrote the mixture would produce a profile of cognitive decline that would be, and here she used a word that I had to read 3 times before I fully accepted it, convincing. Convincing. Someone had designed this, had thought about it carefully enough to combine 2 compounds that together produced a more persuasive result than either one alone. This was not a person who had acted on impulse. This was a person who had done research. I sat at my desk and did the arithmetic that I had been avoiding since the night before. Renee had first offered me tea approximately 6 weeks ago at a Sunday dinner that I had gone to, because Colin had actually called and invited me, which had felt significant enough that I had driven over in the rain. She had presented it as something she had been brewing herself, a wellness habit. She had developed something good for sleep and inflammation. I had drunk it that first night without hesitation, because why would I not? 6 weeks of daily doses if I had complied. I had not complied. I had accepted the jar each visit and drunk varying amounts of it, sometimes a full cup, sometimes a few sips once or twice, nothing at all, because I simply forgot, which meant the accumulation in my system was lower than she had planned for, which meant the timeline she had built her conservatorship petition around was running behind schedule. She was waiting for me to seem worse than I did. I picked up my phone and called Frank. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. "You read it," he said. It was not a question. "I read it," I said. "All of it." "Walter?" His voice was careful in a way Frank's voice almost never was. Frank Delano was a man who said what he thought, in the order he thought it, without much architecture around it. When he got careful, it meant the thing he was about to say was something he had been turning over for a while. I also called Patricia Owens this morning. Dr. Patricia Owens had been my physician for 22 years. She had treated my blood pressure, my knees, the kidney stone that had laid me out for a week in 2019, and the grief that had settled into my body after Joyce died in ways that were not strictly medical, but that she had addressed with a directness and warmth that I had not expected and had been deeply grateful for. She was 65 years old. She had grown up in Bar, Vermont, and she had the kind of fundamental decency that some people are born with and others spend their whole lives trying to develop. What did she say? I asked. She said that approximately 3 months ago, Renee came to her office, said she was concerned about you, said she had noticed some changes in your behavior and your memory, and wanted Dr. Owens' professional opinion on what she was observing. Frank paused. Patricia said she told Renee that she had seen no clinical indicators of cognitive decline in her examinations of you, and that if Renee had specific concerns, she was welcome to have you come in for a formal evaluation. Renee thanked her and left. I thought about that. She was establishing a pattern, I said. Going to Patricia, going to Harmon, building a record of concerned family members, raising flags. That's exactly what she was doing, Frank said. Patricia wants to talk to you directly. She's angry, Walter. In the 20 years I've known that woman, I have never heard her angry, and she is genuinely angry right now. She wants to help. I opened the center drawer of my desk and took out the printed copy of the conservatorship petition that Frank had left with me the evening before. I laid it flat on the desk in front of me and looked at it. It was 11 pages long. It was thorough. It cited 2 separate incidents of what it described as memory lapses, one involving a garage door and one involving a repeated conversation at a family gathering. It included a supporting declaration from Dr. Gerald Harmon, who had never examined me, had never met me, and had apparently been willing to write a clinical assessment of my cognitive state based entirely on what my daughter-in-law had told him over a single cash-paid appointment. And at the bottom of the signature page above the line that read, "Petitioner in handwriting," I had known since the boy was old enough to hold a pencil, was Colin's name. I had been looking at that signature since Frank showed it to me yesterday morning, and I still could not make it mean something different than what it meant. My son, my only child, the boy I had held in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m, while Joyce recovered from a labor that had frightened both of us badly. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball and read a blueprint and change the oil in a car. The boy who had sat in his mother's chair without thinking about it, occupying her space the way children do all those Sunday afternoons that felt like enough. He had signed his name to a document that said, I was no longer a person capable of deciding my own life. My hand was shaking. I looked at it with something close to detachment, the way you look at a part of a structure that is behaving unexpectedly, and I set the petition down and pressed my palm flat against the desk until the trembling stopped. Then I picked up my phone and called Dr. Owens directly. She answered on the second ring. Walter. Her voice was warm and sharp at the same time, the combination that had always made me trust her. I've been waiting for your call. Frank says you're angry, I said. Frank is understating it, she said. I want you to come in today. I want to draw blood and run a full panel properly documented chain of custody maintained from collection to analysis. Whatever is in your system, I want it on record in a way that will hold up in any court in this state. I can be there in an hour, I said. Good. A pause. Then more quietly. Walter, I owe you an apology. When Renee came to my office, I should have called you. I thought she was an anxious daughter-in-law, doing what anxious family members do. I didn't look hard enough at what she was actually building. The regret in her voice was genuine, and it cost her something to say it, and I did not want her to carry that weight unnecessarily. Patricia, I said, you acted in good faith with the information you had. That's all any of us can do. She made a sound that suggested she did not entirely agree with that assessment, but was willing to let it stand for the moment. I put the phone down and sat for another minute with the petition on the desk in front of me, and the lab report open on my screen, and the photograph of Joyce on the corner of the desk, the one from our 25th anniversary where she was laughing at something I had said, and the light was catching her hair. I thought about what she would say right now if she were sitting across from me. She would not tell me to be careful. She would not tell me to slow down. She would look at me with those steady gray eyes of hers, and she would say, Walter, you know what needs to be done. You have always known. Stop sitting here looking at pictures of me and go do it. I folded the petition and put it in my coat pocket alongside the lab report. Then I went upstairs to check on Nora, and then I got in my truck and I drove to Patricia Owens' office and I let her take my blood and I told her everything. I got home at noon and went straight to my desk and sat down and did not move for a very long time. The petition was in front of me again, Colin's signature at the bottom of it. I had looked at that signature so many times in the past 24 hours that I could have reproduced it from memory. Every loop and angle of it, the way his C leaned slightly, left the way it always had since he first learned to write his name at the kitchen table, while Joyce guided his hand. That kitchen table. That same table where Renee had stood this morning, smiling, looking for evidence of a woman she was trying to hunt down. I pressed both hands over my face and breathed. I was not a man who fell apart. Joyce used to say I processed grief the way I processed everything else, slowly and privately, and with a great deal of coffee. But what I was feeling right now was not grief exactly. It was something rawer than that. Something that lived in the space between betrayal and heartbreak and did not have a clean name. My son had signed a document that said I was no longer a person. I heard the creak of the attic stairs, and then Nora appeared in the doorway of my office, moving carefully, one hand braced against the frame. She had found one of Joyce's old cardigans in the dresser upstairs, a thick green wool one that Joyce had worn on cold mornings, and seeing it on someone else made my throat tighten in a way I had not expected. "You look like someone who needs to say something out loud," she said. I looked at her. "You should be resting." "I've been resting for 2 days." She came in and lowered herself carefully into the armchair, in the corner, wincing as her ribs protested. "Talk. It helps. I know because I've been up there doing it to the ceiling for 48 hours. Something loosened in my chest, just slightly. "My son signed that petition," I said. "He knows what it means. He's not a stupid man. He knew exactly what he was signing." "Did he know about the tea?" Nora asked. "Frank doesn't think so." I looked at the signature again. "But he knew about the petition. He told himself it was for my benefit. That's the part I can't get past. Not that he did it. That he found a way to believe it was kindness." Nora was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had the careful quality of someone handling something fragile. "My father did something similar once. Not the same, but close enough. He let someone convince him that hurting me was protecting me." She paused. "I was furious at him for years. Then one day I realized the person I was really furious at was the one who had done the convincing." I looked at her. "Renee?" I said. "Renee," she said. We sat with that for a moment, then Nora reached into the pocket of Joyce's cardigan and produced her phone. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I need to tell you something about that anonymous number, the one that sent me the threats." She turned the phone toward me. "Frank ran the registration trace this afternoon. The number routes through a prepaid account tied to a shell company, but the physical address on the account registration is a storage facility on Route 15 east of town." She met my eyes. "The same facility appears in the vendor payment records I pulled from Millhaven Capital. It's billed as a document storage contractor, but there are no documents stored there. It's a pass-through. Money goes in from Millhaven Capital, gets transferred out within 48 hours to a private account." "Whose account?" I asked. "The LLC is registered to a Marcus Webb," she said. "He has a record in Massachusetts, financial fraud 10 years ago. Changed his name, moved to Vermont, apparently found better partners." Her jaw tightened. "He's not just the person who threatened me. He's the financial architect behind all of it. Renee is the inside operator. Webb handles the outside." I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. 2 people, a coordinated operation. 18 months of theft from people who had trusted a local firm with their savings. "Mr. Greer," Nora said quietly. I looked at her. "I know this is a lot to carry," she said, "and I know I landed on your road and made it worse, but I want you to know something." She held my gaze steadily, and in the green wool cardigan that had belonged to my wife, she looked younger and more tired and more determined than anyone I had met in a long time. "I'm not going anywhere until this is finished. Whatever you need, I owe you that much." I thought about Joyce's voice in my head all morning, telling me to stop sitting and go do it. "What I need," I said, "is to end this properly, in a way that holds." Nora nodded. "Then let's figure out how." I reached for my phone and dialed Frank. Frank arrived at 8 that evening, with a laptop, a legal pad covered in handwriting, and the expression of a man who had spent the day staring into something unpleasant and needed to talk about it. He sat down at my kitchen table, opened the laptop, and turned it to face Nora and me, without preamble. "Marcus Webb," he said. Born Marcus Weber in Quincy, Massachusetts. Convicted of wire fraud in 2014, served 22 months at Devon's Federal Correctional Institution, released 2016. Changed his legal name to Webb, upon release relocated to Vermont, established himself as a financial consultant. Frank tapped the screen. He met Renee at a regional finance conference in Burlington in the spring 3 years ago. 8 months later, the irregularities in Millhaven Capital's vendor accounts begin. Nora leaned forward, her jaw tight. That matches exactly when I started seeing the first discrepancies. Here's how it worked, Frank continued. Renee created vendor codes for 3 fictitious service companies, all 3 LLCs registered in Delaware, which has minimal disclosure requirements. She approved her own invoices using a dual authorization workaround she'd built into the payment system. Money left Millhaven Capital as legitimate vendor payments. He paused. It arrived in Webb's accounts within 48 hours. I looked at the numbers on the screen. 18 months, dozens of transactions, each one small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic compliance alerts. Together, they added up to $1.9 million pulled from accounts belonging to ordinary people in Millhaven who had trusted a local firm with their retirement savings. The anonymous number, I said. The one that threatened Nora, Frank nodded. Registered to one of Webb's Delaware LLCs, and Walter. He looked at me steadily. That same number called your phone twice this week. Once yesterday morning, after Dr. Owens left, once the day before. He turned the laptop slightly. Webb has been watching this house. I found his vehicle, a gray Ford Transit, parked twice on the county road below your property in the past 4 days. He's been reporting your movements back to Renee. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Nora's hands tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. He's the one who ran me off the road, she said, her voice dropping low and fierce. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but it was a dark vehicle, large, a van or a truck. Gray Ford Transit, Frank said quietly. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the wind outside pushing against the windows. Then Nora pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth, her eyes bright and furious, fighting back something that was equal parts terror and rage. They tried to kill me, she said. The words came out stripped down and bare. They actually tried to kill me over a spreadsheet. Over $1.9 million, Frank said, and over the fact that you were the only person paying close enough attention to find it. I stood up and walked to the window. Down the county road below my property, somewhere in the dark, Marcus Webb might be sitting in a gray van right now, watching the lights in my kitchen, reporting back to Renee. The thought did not frighten me the way it might have a week ago. It made me angry in a way that felt clean and useful. Frank, I said, turning back, can everything you found be documented in a form that holds up in a Vermont courtroom? Most of it, yes. The financial records are public filings or obtained through legitimate channels. The vehicle surveillance I can corroborate through 2 separate sightings. He paused. The lab results from Dr. Cole combined with Patricia's official blood work give us the medical evidence. The conservatorship petition is a public court filing. What we don't yet have, I said, is Renee saying any of this herself. Frank looked at me. Nora looked at me. The same thought was moving across all 3 of our faces at the same moment. We need her to say it, Nora said. Yes, I said. We do. I picked up my phone from the counter and held it for a moment, thinking about Colin, about the signature at the bottom of that petition, about a boy learning to write his name at a kitchen table. Then I set the phone back down. Not yet, I said. Tomorrow, when I know exactly what I'm going to say. Dr. Patricia Owens arrived at 9 in the morning with her black medical bag, a thermos of coffee she had made at home, and an expression that told me she had not slept particularly well either. She was a trim woman of 65, with silver hair she kept short and practical, and she had the particular quality of stillness that good doctors develop over decades, the ability to walk into a room and make it feel like whatever was happening there was manageable. She had sat beside Joyce in this same house during the hard weeks before the end, and I had never forgotten the steadiness she brought to those rooms. She set her bag on the kitchen table, opened it, and looked at me directly. How are you feeling, honestly? Angry, I said. Mostly angry. She nodded like that was the correct answer. Good. Angry means clear-headed. Sit down. She drew 3 vials of blood with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, labeled each one with her own handwriting, sealed them in a biohazard transport bag, and signed across the seal. Chain of custody, she said, holding it up. This means every person who handles this sample from this moment forward is documented. When this goes to the state lab, there will be no question about where it came from, or whether it was tampered with. Will it hold up in court? I asked. It will hold up in any court in Vermont, she said. I'll stake my license on it. She poured us both coffee from her thermos and sat down across from me, and for a few minutes we simply sat in the kitchen the way old friends do when the situation is serious enough that small talk would be an insult to it. Patricia, I said, when Renee came to your office, did she seem nervous? She thought about it carefully. No, that's what troubled me when Frank called. She was composed, rehearsed looking back on it. She used clinical language she shouldn't have known unless she'd done research. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I've been in medicine for 40 years, Walter. I've seen family members come in worried about elderly parents. They cry, they stumble over their words. They feel guilty for raising the concern at all. Her mouth tightened. Renee did none of those things. She presented like she was filing a report. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. Sheriff Morrow. I answered it and put it on speaker so Dr. Owens could hear. Walter, Morrow's voice was measured. I'm following up on our conversation yesterday morning. I wanted to ask whether you'd noticed any unfamiliar vehicles parked on the county road below your property in the past few days. I looked at Dr. Owens. She raised her eyebrows slightly. A gray van, I said carefully. Ford Transit. I noticed it twice. Didn't think much of it at the time. A pause. We had a report from a resident further down the road. Same vehicle parked for extended periods, possibly connected to the Ellison situation. Another pause. Walter, is there anything else you want to tell me? The question sat in the air between us. Dr. Owens was watching me with those steady eyes of hers, and I made a decision. Not yet, Dale, I said, but soon, I promise you that. He was quiet for a moment, then, all right, you know where to find me. He hung up. Dr. Owens looked at me across the table. You're building towards something, she said. It was not a question. I need 2 more days, I said. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I'll be ready to testify the moment you need me. She stood, picked up her bag, and paused at the kitchen door. She turned back and looked at me with an expression that made my throat tighten. Joyce would be proud of you, she said quietly. I want you to know that. I could not answer that immediately. I pressed my hand flat against the table and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. Thank you, Patricia, I finally managed. She left. I sat alone in the kitchen. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I stared at the screen for 3 long seconds, feeling the anger in my chest sharpen into something cold and purposeful. I did not answer. Instead, I sent Frank a single text. He's watching again. Right now. Frank's reply came back in under a minute. I see him. Got the plate. Go find your son. I did not go find my son that afternoon. Frank's text said go, but something pulled me upstairs first to the room at the end of the hall that I had been avoiding for 2 years, the way you avoid a place that holds too much of someone. Our bedroom, mine, and Joyce's. I needed the homeowner's insurance policy for the house. It lived in the bottom drawer of the old oak dresser in a manila folder labeled in Joyce's handwriting. I had not opened that drawer since the week after the funeral, when I had needed the death certificate, and had stood in this room for 40 minutes afterward without being able to remember why I had come in. The room still smelled like her, faintly the way a scent clings to wood and fabric long after its source is gone. Lavender and something warmer underneath it, something that was simply Joyce and had no other name. I opened the bottom drawer. The insurance folder was there. Beneath it, a small stack of photographs I hadn't seen in years. Beneath those, pushed to the back, a white envelope. I picked it up. My name was on the front. Walter. Her handwriting the looping, careful script she had used her whole life, the one she had tried to teach Colin at the kitchen table when he was 6 years old. The envelope was sealed. The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held it for a long time. Then I opened it. The letter was 2 pages written on the cream stationery she kept in the nightstand. It was dated 14 months ago, 3 months before she died. She wrote that she had been wanting to say something for a long time and could not find the right moment. She wrote that she loved Colin more than she had words for, and that loving him meant she had to tell me what she had seen. She had noticed things about Renee from the beginning. Small things. The way Renee's eyes moved to exits and valuables when she entered a room. The questions she asked about the house always framed as admiration, always landing just slightly too close to what things were worth. The way she spoke to Colin in public versus private, two completely different registers, one warm and one cold. Joyce had watched for 2 years before she allowed herself to believe what she was seeing. She wrote, "I don't have proof, Walter. I only have 40 years of reading people, and every one of those years is telling me the same thing. That woman does not love our son. She loves what our son will eventually inherit." She wrote, "I'm not telling you this to make you act. I'm telling you because I am running out of time and I cannot leave without saying it. If I'm wrong, then this letter means nothing and you can forgive me for it. But if I'm right and something happens, I want you to know that I saw it coming and I tried." The last paragraph was shorter. The handwriting was slightly less steady the way it got in her final months when the medication made her hands unreliable. She wrote, "Walter, if something ever feels wrong, trust your hands. You built everything we have. Don't let anyone take it. And don't let them take our boy." I do not know how long I sat on the edge of that bed. At some point my face was wet, and I had not noticed it happening. I pressed the letter against my chest, both hands flat over it, and I breathed the way you breathe when something has been broken open inside you that needed to be broken open. She had known. 14 months ago in this room, with the medication making her hands shake, she had written down the truth because she could not carry it out of the world with her. She had left it here for me to find when I was ready. I was ready now. I folded the letter carefully. I placed it in my shirt pocket directly over my heart. I stood up and my knees ached and I did not care. Then I went downstairs and picked up my phone and called Frank. "I'm ready," I said. "Bring Colin to me tonight, back door and Frank." I stopped. "Thank you for all of it." A pause. Then Frank said in the voice of a man who understood exactly what had just happened in that room, "I'll have him there by 7:30. Frank arrived at 7 the next morning with Colin. I heard the back door open and 2 sets of footsteps in the mudroom, one heavy and certain, and one that hesitated on the threshold the way a man hesitates when he is not sure he deserves to cross it. I was sitting at the kitchen table with 3 folders in front of me and a pot of coffee that I had made an hour earlier and not touched. Colin came through the door and stopped when he saw my face. He looked terrible. He had not shaved in days, and his eyes had the sunken red-rimmed quality of a man who had been fighting with himself in the dark for too long and losing. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn to my house 4 days ago, and he stood in my kitchen with his hands at his sides and his jaw working and did not seem to be able to find a single word. Frank sat down quietly at the far end of the table and looked at his coffee cup. I looked at my son. "Sit down, Colin," I said. He sat. And then, because I had decided the night before that there was no version of this conversation that benefited from gentleness, I slid the conservatorship petition across the table and pointed to his signature. Colin looked at it. His face went the color of old ash. His hands came up and covered his mouth, and I watched his eyes fill, and he blinked hard twice, and the tears came down anyway. "She told me it was to protect you," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She said you were getting worse. She said if we didn't act now, you'd make decisions that would cost you everything." "Colin," I kept my voice level, "do you know what conservatorship means under Vermont law?" He shook his head, and I could see that he genuinely did not, and that landed somewhere painful because it meant he had signed it without understanding what he was signing, which was its own kind of answer about what Renee had done to him. "It means I cease to exist as a legal person," I said. "It means I cannot sign a check or sell a property or make a single decision about my own life without court approval. It means everything your mother and I spent 40 years building transfers to a guardian appointed by a judge." I paused. "The petitioner recommends you and Renee as that guardian." Colin made a sound that was not quite a word. His hands were shaking against the table, fingertips pressing down hard on the wood, like he needed something solid to hold on to. "Dad, I didn't know. I know you didn't know about the tea," I said. "Frank told me, but you knew about this." I touched the petition. "And you signed it." He put his face in his hands and his shoulders heaved once hard, and the sound he made was the sound of a grown man coming apart in his father's kitchen at 7 in the morning, and it cost me something to sit across from it and not reach for him. Not yet. Frank cleared his throat gently. "We need to move, Walter." I looked at Frank, then I looked back at Colin. "Tonight you will see who your wife really is," I said. "When it's over, you decide who you are." Colin looked up at me with red eyes and a face that had shed 10 years of careful composure. He nodded once slowly. We drove to Sheriff Morrow's office at 8:30. Frank and I sat across from Dale in his office while Colin waited in the truck. I laid everything on his desk in order. The lab report from Dr. Sandra Cole, the chain of custody blood work from Dr. Owens, the conservatorship petition, Frank's documentation on Marcus Webb, including the vehicle surveillance and the Delaware LLC records. Morrow read everything without speaking. He was a thorough man. He turned pages carefully, went back twice to reread sections, and kept his expression neutral, in the way of someone who had learned that reactions were data that other people used. When he finished, he looked up at me. "Walter," he said, "why didn't you bring this to me 4 days ago?" "Because 4 days ago I had a jar of tea and a bad feeling," I said. "And because I didn't know yet who in this town I could trust with it." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and answered it. "Dr. Owens." He listened. His jaw tightened once. "Yes, I understand." He hung up and sat back in his chair, and something behind his eyes had changed. "Patricia Owens has been my family's doctor for 20 years, he said quietly. "If she says the blood work is real, it's real." He looked at the folders on his desk. "Tell me the plan," I told him. "Vermont operates under a one-party consent law for audio recording," I explained, which meant that as long as one person present in a conversation consented to being recorded, the recording was legally admissible in court. Morrow and his deputies would be that consenting party. Everything Renee said inside my house tonight would be on the record. Morrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, if this goes wrong, I cannot protect you." I said, "If this goes wrong, there's nothing left to protect." He looked at me for a long time. Outside his window, Millhaven went about its December morning, people shoveling walks and starting cars and living ordinary lives in an ordinary town. Then he nodded. "Tonight," he said, "my deputies and I will be at your house by 9, civilian vehicles only, no markings." I stood up and shook his hand, and his grip was firm and dry and certain, and I drove home with the letter in my shirt pocket and my son sitting in the back seat not saying a word, and the mountains ahead of us hard and white and very still against the winter sky. I got home at 10:30 and sat in the kitchen with a legal pad and spent 2 hours writing out exactly what I was going to say and exactly how I was going to say it. This was how I had always worked. Before any significant conversation, any negotiation, any meeting where the outcome mattered, I wrote it out first. Joyce used to tease me about it, said I was the only man in Vermont who prepared for dinner parties the way other people prepared for depositions. I had told her that preparation was just respect for the stakes involved. The stakes had never been higher than this. At 1 in the afternoon, I called Frank. "I'm ready," I said. "Are you in position?" "Parked on the county road," he said, 230 meters from your front door. I've got a clear line of sight to the driveway and both street approaches. Colin's phone is on. If he makes any calls after you hang up, I'll know within 2 minutes. "Good," I said. "Here we go." I hung up with Frank and dialed Colin. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight and careful, in the way it had been since this morning. "Dad," I let my voice go soft and slightly vague at the edges, the way voices go, when a man is tired and not quite tracking. It was not a difficult performance. I had spent enough time around people whose minds were genuinely slipping to know what it sounded like, and I hated myself slightly for using it. "Colin," I said, "I was cleaning out the garage this afternoon. You know how I get, I start one thing and end up doing 3 others. I paused, let the pause run a beat too long. "I found a cell phone back behind the paint cans. Must have fallen out of someone's pocket. I don't recognize it. But when I turned it on, there were all these messages on it. Strange messages. Something about Millhaven Capital and accounts, and I don't know, it didn't make much sense to me, but some of the messages mentioned your wife's name." A silence on Colin's end. Short, but complete. "I thought maybe I should take it down to Sheriff Morrow's office tomorrow," I said. "Turn it in. That's what you do with found property, isn't it? I can't remember if there's a form or if you just hand it to whoever's at the front desk." "Dad." Colin's voice had changed. Something behind it had gone very still. "Don't do anything with that phone yet. I'll come by tomorrow and take a look at it first. Okay, just leave it on the kitchen counter." "Oh, that's a good idea," I said. "You're a good boy, Colin. I always said so." "I'll see you tomorrow," he said. "Don't go anywhere tonight." We hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked at the legal pad in front of me and felt the particular hollowness of a plan working exactly as designed. 12 minutes passed. Then Frank called. "She took it," he said. "Renee called Marcus Webb 40 seconds after Colin called her. 4-minute conversation. Then Webb called 2 other numbers I haven't identified yet. She's moving tonight, Walter, not tomorrow." I had expected this. Renee was not a patient woman when she felt her timeline threatened. And Colin. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell me what was coming before Frank said it. "Colin called Renee," Frank said. "Right after he hung up with you, told her everything. The phone, the messages, what you said about going tomorrow." I put my hand flat on the legal pad. The paper was smooth and cool under my palm. "I see," I said. "Walter, I'm sorry. I thought about Colin's face this morning in my kitchen, the tears running down without him being able to stop them, the sound he had made when his composure finally broke. I thought about how genuinely devastated he had looked, and I thought about how 3 hours later he had picked up his phone and called his wife anyway. That was the thing about people who had been controlled for long enough. Even when they saw the cage clearly, they still reached for the door out of habit. "Don't be sorry," I said to Frank. "It tells us exactly where he is. We can work with that." "Do you still want me to bring him tonight?" Frank asked. "For the trap, I mean. To witness." I looked at the letter in my shirt pocket, felt the paper through the fabric, Joyce's voice in my head steady and clear. "Don't let them take our boy." "Yes," I said. "Bring him. He needs to see it with his own eyes. All of it." I paused. "Frank makes sure he understands that what happens tonight is the only thing that can actually save him." "Understood," Frank said. "I'll have him at your back door by 8:30. I set the phone down and stood up and went to the kitchen window. Outside, the afternoon light was failing fast, the way it does in Vermont in December, the sky going from pale gray to deep blue to nothing in the space of an hour. Somewhere down the county road, Marcus Webb was in his gray van making phone calls. Somewhere across town, Renee was making plans. I thought about Joyce building this house with me, weekend by weekend, her hands in work gloves that were always slightly too large, laughing when she dropped a nail, handing me a level with the same seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. We built it together, I thought. Nobody takes it. I went upstairs to check on Nora, and then I went to my desk, and I began to prepare for the last thing I would ever need to prepare for in this particular fight. Frank brought Colin through the back door at 8:32. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had not drunk, and the conservatorship petition open in front of me and the photograph of Joyce on the counter where I could see it without turning my head. I had arranged those things deliberately, not for theater, because they were the truth of what this conversation was about, and I wanted the truth present in the room. Colin came in first. He stopped when he saw the petition on the table, and the color left his face so completely and so fast that for a moment I thought he might need to sit down before I asked him to. Frank closed the back door quietly and leaned against the wall near the mudroom entrance with his arms folded and his eyes on the floor, giving us the room without leaving it. "Sit down," I said. Colin sat. He was still wearing his coat, which meant some part of him had not committed to staying, and I noted that without comment. "You called her," I said. "After I called you this afternoon, you called Renee and told her everything." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, and his hands came up and gripped the edge of the table so hard I could see the tendons standing out on the backs of them. His eyes had gone bright and wet and desperate, the eyes of a man who had been cornered by a version of himself he did not want to look at directly. "I know," he said. His voice came out wrecked. "I know I did. I don't know why I—" He stopped. His throat worked. "That's not true. I do know why. I've been doing it for so long it happens before I can think about it. She calls and I tell her. She asks and I answer. I don't even—" His voice broke on the last word, and he pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth and breathed through his nose for a moment. "I don't even know when I stopped being able to stop myself." The kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the knock of the radiator in the hallway. I looked at my son. At the man he had become, or perhaps more accurately at the man he had been reduced to, and I felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained elements of both, wrapped around something older and deeper that was simply love, stubborn and persistent and apparently indestructible. "What, Colin?" I said. "Did you know what conservatorship meant when you signed it?" He shook his head. "She explained it as a protective measure, said it would prevent you from making financial decisions that could cost you the house, Said it was standard for someone your age showing early signs. He looked up at me, and his eyes were running over, now tears tracking down, without him bothering to stop them. Dad, I swear to you, I did not know it meant what you told me this morning. I did not know it meant taking away your rights. She never said that. But you knew something felt wrong, I said. Didn't you? It was not a question, and he knew it was not a question, and the way his face crumpled told me I was right. Yes, he said. It came out barely above a breath. And you signed it anyway. Yes? I stood up from my chair and walked to the counter and stood there with my back to him for a moment, looking at Joyce's photograph. She was laughing in it, caught mid-sentence at our 25th anniversary dinner, completely unaware that anyone had a camera pointed at her. She had hated posed photographs, said they never looked like the person, only like what the person thought they were supposed to look like. This boy, I thought. This boy we made together. Look what happened to him. I turned back around. She used your gambling debt, I said. Frank found the records. She has been holding it over you. Whatever she asked you to do, you did it because she had something on you that you were afraid of. Colin's head dropped forward. His shoulders shook once violently, and then he got himself back under control, with what looked like an enormous physical effort, pressing both palms flat on the table, breathing deliberately. The debt is real, he said. I owe $43,000 to people who are not patient about it. Renee found out 2 years ago. She said she would cover it. She said all I had to do was trust her. A sound came out of him then that was almost a laugh, but had nothing in it that was funny. $43,000. That's what I sold my father for. The words fell into the room and sat there. I came back to the table, and I pulled out my chair, and I sat down across from my son, and I looked at him for a long moment without speaking, because I needed to say the next thing correctly, and I only had one chance at it. I'm not going to tell you that I'm not hurt, I said. I am, deeply. And I'm not going to tell you that what you did was acceptable, because it was not. I paused. But I know the difference between a man who did something wrong and a man who is wrong. You are the first kind, and that matters. Colin looked up at me. His face was a wreck, red and swollen, and stripped of every layer he had built up over the years, of living inside Renee's version of who he was supposed to be. And underneath all of that was someone I recognized, someone I had known for 41 years. What do I do? He asked. Tonight, I said, you are going to sit in the dark in my living room, and you are going to watch your wife walk into this house believing she has already won. You are going to hear what she says when she thinks no one who matters is listening. I held his gaze. And then you are going to decide with full information who you choose to be. Colin pressed the back of both hands over his eyes, and a sound came out of him that I had not heard since he was very small, and the world had hurt him in some way that surprised him with its sharpness. Then he lowered his hands and looked at me with eyes that were raw and red, and for the first time in years, entirely his own. Okay, he said. Okay, Dad. Frank pushed off from the wall. We've got 40 minutes before Morrow's people arrive, he said quietly. We should get the house ready. I stood up. I put my hand on Colin's shoulder for a moment, the way I had when he was small and the world had been manageable, and the problems we faced together were the size of broken bicycles and failed math tests. He reached up and covered my hand with his, and his grip was tight and trembling, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the grip did not already contain. Then I let go, and we went to work. Colin spent the day at my house. He did not go home. I did not ask him to, and he did not offer to. He sat in the living room for most of the afternoon with his hands on his knees, not watching the television I had left on for him. And when I brought him a sandwich at noon, he ate it without tasting it. Some waiting cannot be made comfortable. You simply move through it. Morrow arrived at 9 with 2 deputies I knew by sight, but not by name. They came through the back door in civilian clothes, no markings, no uniforms. Their vehicles parked 300 meters down the county road in the turnout by the old Hendricks barn, where nobody parked unless they were lost or hunting. Frank had walked them up through the tree line along the property edge, a route that was invisible from the driveway and from the county road both. If Renee or Marcus Webb drove past on their approach, they would see a dark house on a dark hill, with one light in the kitchen window, exactly the kind of scene that invited confidence. Morrow shook my hand at the back door without speaking. He had a small digital recorder in his breast pocket, the kind that captured ambient sound from 20 feet in any direction, and was admissible under Vermont's one-party consent statute. One of his deputies had a second recorder, The other had a body camera clipped inside the collar of his jacket. We had done everything correctly. The law was on our side in this room tonight, and I wanted it to stay there. I turned off all the lights except the one over the kitchen stove, which threw a low amber glow across the counters and left the rest of the house in deep shadow. Morrow and his deputies took positions in the living room behind the couch, and in the alcove beside the bookcase, places where they were invisible from the front door, but had clear lines of sight to the center of the room. Frank went upstairs to stay with Nora. Colin sat in the armchair in the far corner of the living room, the one that faced away from the window. He had not spoken since we finished arranging the room. He was sitting very straight and very still, with his hands on his knees, and in the dim light from the kitchen, he looked like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew. I sat in my chair at the kitchen table. The house was quiet in the way houses go quiet when they are full of people holding their breath. Nora came downstairs at 9:20. She moved carefully, one hand on the railing, and came to the kitchen doorway and looked at me. "You should be upstairs," I said. "I know," she said. She came in anyway and sat down across from me, and I decided not to argue about it because there was not enough time and because I understood the impulse completely. We sat together in the amber kitchen light while the house held its breath around us. "Mr. Greer," she said quietly. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "That night on Henderson Road, you didn't know me. You didn't know what I was involved in, or whether I was telling the truth, or whether helping me was going to cost you everything." She looked at me steadily across the table. "Why did you stop?" I thought about Joyce, about the way she had said it so many times over so many years that it had become the architecture of how I moved through the world without me ever consciously deciding that it would. "My wife used to say that a life is measured not by what you build, but by what you choose to do when it costs you something," I said. I looked at the photograph on the counter, Joyce laughing at our anniversary dinner, entirely unaware of the camera. She lived by that completely, and she's been gone for 2 years, and I am still trying to be the man she thought I was. Nora's eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the table for a moment, and when she looked back up, there was something in her face that I recognized as the particular expression of a person who has been without something for a long time, and has just been unexpectedly reminded that it exists. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Nora said. "She was the best person I ever knew," I said. "And she left me a letter telling me not to let anyone take what we built." I touched the pocket over my heart. "I intend to keep that promise." From the living room, Morrow's voice came low and even. "Walter, Webb's vehicle just passed the county road junction heading north. He slowed at your driveway entrance and kept going. He's doing a pass." I looked at Nora. She straightened in her chair, and I watched her pull something up from somewhere deep, the same quality I had seen in her on Henderson Road when she was hurt and terrified and still fighting to stay present. "Go upstairs," I said. "Lock the door. Don't come down regardless of what you hear." She stood up. She looked at me for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. "Finish it," she said. Then she went upstairs, and her footsteps were careful and quiet on the treads, and I heard the soft click of the door at the top. I sat alone in the kitchen. I took the letter from my shirt pocket and unfolded it one last time. I read the last paragraph, Joyce's handwriting, slightly unsteady from the medication, the words clear and certain, despite it. "Trust your hands. You built everything we have. Don't let anyone take it. And don't let them take our boy." I folded it carefully and put it in the kitchen drawer. Not my pocket. The drawer. Because what was in that letter had already done its work, and what came next belonged to me. From outside, the sound of a car engine cutting off. Tires on the frozen gravel of the driveway, closer now. Then nothing. Then footsteps on the front walk. Frank's voice from upstairs, barely above a breath, traveling down through the old bones of the house. "They're at the door, Walter." I pressed both palms down against the kitchen table and stayed very still. The wood held. It always had. The same table where Colin had learned to write his name. The same table where Joyce had drunk her morning coffee for 38 years. I breathed in. I breathed out. The knock came. Before I tell you what happened when that door opened, comment justice below, because in the next few minutes, every single thing Renee believes she had gotten away with is about to come apart, and I want to know you are here for it. A reminder. This story contains fictional elements added to bring the message to life. Any resemblance to names or places is not intentional, but what this story says about Trust Family and the truth coming out, that part I stand behind completely. I did not answer the door immediately. I let it knock 3 times, slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that belongs to a person who is certain of their welcome. Then I got up from the kitchen table and walked to the front door and opened it. Renee was standing on my porch in a dark wool coat, her hair pulled back, her face composed in the expression I had come to think of as her default setting, that assembled pleasantness that sat on her features the way a coat of paint sits on old wood. You could see it was there. You just could not see what was underneath it. Marcus Webb stood 2 steps behind her, and to her left, a large man in his mid-40s with the kind of stillness that comes from professional patience. He was carrying a leather document folder under one arm, the property transfer papers, I assumed. Renee had brought him to witness the signature. She had planned this the way she planned everything, with someone present who could corroborate that the transaction was voluntary. He was not someone I would have noticed in a crowd, which I suspected was deliberate. "Walter," Renee said, "we need to talk." "Come in," I said. I stepped back. They came inside. I closed the door behind them. The house was dark except for the amber glow from the kitchen stove light, and I watched Renee's eyes move across the room, the way they always moved, cataloging, assessing, finding the exits and the angles. She had been doing this every time she walked into a space for as long as I had known her. I had always seen it. I had simply not known until recently what it meant. "Where is she?" Renee asked. "Who?" I said. She smiled, and it was the first time I had ever seen her smile without the assembled pleasantness behind it. This smile was something else entirely. It was the smile of a person who had decided that the performance was over and found the honesty of that genuinely relieving. "The girl," she said. "Nora Ellison. I know she's here, Walter. We've been watching this house for 4 days." She moved further into the living room, glancing toward the hallway and the stairs. "I also know about the phone you found in your garage, which, by the way, was a very clever little story. Colin was always terrible at keeping things from me. Did you know he called me within 10 minutes of hanging up with you?" "I know," I said. That surprised her, just slightly. Her head tilted a fraction of an inch. "Then you know I'm not here to negotiate," she said. She clasped her hands in front of her, perfectly composed, a woman conducting a meeting she had scheduled and prepared for. "I'm here because this has gone on long enough, and it ends tonight. You are going to tell me where Nora Ellison is. And then you are going to sign the updated property transfer documents that Marcus has with him. And then we are all going to move forward." "Move forward," I said. "That's right." I looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had come into my son's life and spent years building something patient and calculated and cold, standing in my own kitchen talking about moving forward as though the past 4 years were simply a transaction that needed closing. "Renee," I said, "why don't you tell me what was actually in that tea?" Something shifted behind her eyes. A recalculation. Then I reached into my shirt pocket and set the small glass jar on the table between us, the one Frank's contact had analyzed. I placed it carefully without drama, the way you place evidence. "Clonazepam," I said, "and scopolamine." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. I counted them. And then Renee made the mistake I had been waiting for. Not because she was careless, because she was certain. Certain the house was empty, certain the old man across from her had no allies, certain she had already won. Certainty is its own kind of blindness. "You did your homework," she said, and her voice shifted into something unguarded. "Give it another 6 weeks and any physician would have diagnosed mid-stage cognitive decline. The conservatorship would have sailed through probate court." She looked at the jar. It was a good plan. It would have worked. She then reached into her coat and produced her phone. She dialed without hesitation. "Dale." "It's Renee Greer. I'm at my father-in-law's house on Henderson Road. He seems confused and he's been keeping a young woman here against her will. I think you should come right away." She lowered the phone and looked at me with the expression of someone who had just played their final card. "Dale Morrow has known this family for 20 years, she said. "He's going to walk in that door, and whatever you've been building collapses." "Is it?" I said. From the darkness of the living room, a voice came. "I'm already here, Mrs. Greer." Renee turned. Dale Morrow stepped out from the alcove beside the bookcase, recorder in hand, his face carrying the expression of a man who has just heard something he will think about for a very long time. His 2 deputies emerged from behind the couch. Webb moved toward the front door. The nearer deputy crossed the room in 4 strides and had his arm before he took 2 steps. Miranda rights followed, flat and professional. Webb did not resist. The second deputy moved toward Renee. And then Colin stepped out of the corner armchair. He walked into the kitchen light, and his face was something I have no adequate language for. Not triumph, not relief. The face of a man who has just watched the scaffolding of everything he understood about his own life come down at once, finding himself still standing in the rubble, unable yet to determine what that meant. Renee looked at her husband. For the first time in all the years I had known her, nothing came back. No pleasantness, no calculation. Just something rawer and smaller beneath all of it. And then the handcuffs clicked, and she looked away. "Colin," she said. Her voice carried something I had never heard in it before. Colin said nothing. His hands were shaking at his sides, and he stood in the amber kitchen light and did not move, and did not speak. They took her out into the December night. The door closed. The house was quiet. Colin made a sound beside me that came from somewhere past words, and I put my arm around my son's shoulders and held on, and he pressed his forehead against my shoulder, and the shaking moved through him in long waves, and I stood in my kitchen and held my boy and did not let go. The statements took until 2 in the morning. Morrow sat across from me at my own kitchen table with a legal pad and a recorder, and asked his questions in the careful, methodical way of a man who understood that what he was building tonight needed to hold up for a long time. I answered everything, all of it, from the first sip of tea to the small glass jar in my coat pocket, to the night on Henderson Road, to Frank's contacts in Burlington, to the letter in the kitchen drawer that I showed him without being asked. He read Joyce's letter with his reading glasses on, and his face very still, and when he finished, he folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back to me without comment. Some things did not require comment. Colin gave his statement in the living room with one of the deputies. I could hear his voice through the wall, quiet and steady, in a way it had not been all week, the voice of a man who had made a decision and was living inside it now. He told them everything he knew, the debt, the pressure, the signature, the phone call this afternoon. He did not minimize any of it. I was proud of him for that, and the pride sat alongside the hurt without displacing it, because that was how it was going to be for a while, and I had accepted that. Nora came downstairs at midnight, when Morrow told her it was safe, and she sat at my kitchen table and gave her statement with the focused precision of an accountant walking an auditor through a set of books. Each transaction documented, each date confirmed, each irregularity explained. Morrow's pen moved steadily across his legal pad for 40 minutes. When she finished, he looked up at her. "Ms. Ellison, I want you to know that the Vermont State Police will be coordinating with the FBI field office in Burlington on the financial fraud component. Given the scope of the scheme, this will likely become a federal matter." He paused. "You should also know that under the federal Dodd-Frank Whistleblower Protection Act, your actions in preserving those documents and bringing them forward are protected. The charges against you are going to be dropped. All of them." Nora pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Her shoulders dropped slowly the way tension leaves a body when it has been held for so long that its release feels unfamiliar. Then she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and breathed, and her eyes filled, and she let them. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery moved with a speed that surprised me, though Frank said it shouldn't have. When a case had this much documentation and a recorded confession from the primary subject, he said prosecutors did not dawdle. Renee was charged with attempted murder in the first degree for the systematic poisoning, aggravated assault conspiracy to commit murder, and financial fraud. The last charge was filed jointly with federal prosecutors once the FBI confirmed the interstate nature of the Delaware shell companies. She was held without bail at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, which was 53 miles from Millhaven and might as well have been the surface of the moon. Marcus Webb was charged with conspiracy, financial fraud, and reckless endangerment for the incident on Route 108 that had sent Nora over the shoulder of the road. His prior conviction in Massachusetts meant the federal charges carried enhanced sentencing guidelines. His attorney entered preliminary plea discussions within 2 weeks. Dr. Gerald Harmon surrendered his medical license to the Vermont Board of Medical Practice before the board could convene a formal hearing. He faced separate criminal charges for filing a fraudulent clinical assessment, a charge that carried up to 5 years under Vermont statutes. Colin appeared before a judge in Lamoille County District Court on a Tuesday morning in January. I drove him there and sat in the gallery behind him. The charge was accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. His attorney had negotiated with the district attorney's office, presenting Colin's voluntary cooperation, his complete disclosure, and the documented history of financial coercion as mitigating factors. The judge listened to everything and sentenced him to 3 years of supervised probation and 200 hours of community service. No prison time. Colin stood when the sentence was read and thanked the judge in a voice that did not waver. Then he turned and looked at me across the gallery, and I nodded once, and that was enough. In the hallway afterward, he came and stood beside me, and we walked out of the courthouse together into the January cold, and he said, "I'm going to pay back every cent of that debt myself, without her help, without anyone's help." "I know you will," I said. "It's going to take a while," he said. "Most things worth doing do," I said. We stood on the courthouse steps for a moment in the cold, gray January light. 2 Greer men in winter coats, and Colin looked at the mountains on the horizon, the way he had looked at them when he was small, with that particular expression that meant he was thinking about something larger than the immediate moment. "Dad," he said. "Yeah, I'm sorry." He said it simply, without the theater of it, without the red eyes and the shaking hands of the kitchen 2 weeks ago. Just the fact of it, stated plainly the way you state something you intend to live inside, rather than simply say once. For all of it. For every part of it. I put my hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder I had touched in my kitchen the night before the trap, when the grip between us had contained everything neither of us could say. "I know," I said. "Come have dinner with me on Sunday." He looked at me. Something shifted in his face, something opening rather than closing, and his eyes went bright for just a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Nora stopped by my house 2 days after the courthouse. She was moving into a short-term rental in Burlington while the legal proceedings continued, and she came to collect a sweater she had left upstairs and to return Joyce's green cardigan, which she had folded carefully and placed in a paper bag with a handwritten note tucked under the collar. I did not read the note until after she left. It said, "For the woman who raised a man like you." I wish I had known her. I put the note in the kitchen drawer alongside Joyce's letter. Dr. Owens came by that Friday with a bottle of wine she said was from her personal collection, and which was considerably better than anything I kept in the house. Frank arrived 20 minutes later with no invitation and a bag of groceries, and the comfortable presumption of a man who had been walking into this kitchen for 40 years and saw no reason to change the habit. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, and ate the dinner Frank made, and drank Patricia's wine, and talked about things that had nothing to do with Renee or conservatorships, or the particular darkness that had moved through this house for the past several weeks. Outside the window, January lay across the Vermont hills, white and still and very cold. Inside the kitchen was warm. The snow was gone by March. Vermont lets go of winter the way it does everything slowly and on its own terms, pulling back from the hillsides in stages, until one morning you walk onto your porch and realize the mountains have gone from white to the pale green of early spring. Renee received 25 years in late February. I sat in the gallery and heard the number without expression, because the number was not the point. The house was still mine. The accounts were intact. That was the point. Marcus Webb took a federal plea deal in January, 12 years. Dr. Harmon surrendered his medical license before the board could take it from him. Nora was cleared of every charge under the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act and accepted a position at a compliance firm in Burlington. She called me on a Sunday evening to tell me, and I could hear in her voice the sound of a person who had come through something that should have broken her and found that it hadn't. Colin came for dinner most Sundays. He was working double shifts to pay down the debt himself without help from anyone, and some weeks he arrived tired enough that he fell asleep in the armchair after we ate. I did not mind. I covered him with Joyce's old blanket and let him sleep, and the house felt less empty for it. On the last Saturday of March, I planted black-eyed Susans along the south wall, the same bed Joyce had tended for 30 years, and that I had let go to seed after she died. My knees hurt the entire time. I didn't care. When I finished, I went inside, washed the dirt from my hands, and carried my coffee into the living room. Joyce's chair was across from mine. I had put a small bunch of dried flowers on the table beside it that morning. The chair was still empty. That was not going to change, and I had made my peace with that, the way you make peace with true things, not by feeling better about them, but by learning to carry them alongside everything else. But it did not feel the way it had felt in December. Something had shifted, in the room, or in me, or in the space between the two. I thought about her letter in the kitchen drawer. Trust your hands. You built everything we have. Don't let anyone take it. And don't let them take our boy. I had done all of those things. The boy was coming to dinner on Sunday. The house was standing. And outside the window, under 6 inches of Vermont soil, the black-eyed Susans were waiting. She had always said they were stubborn flowers. She had always said they would come back. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at her chair, and for the first time in 2 years and 3 months, I did not look away. Looking back at this family story, I think about what it cost me to trust the wrong person and nearly lose everything I had built. It cost me sleep. It cost me months of doubt. It almost cost me my son. But here is what I know now. God puts the right people on the right roads at the right moments. That night on Henderson Ridge in the middle of a Vermont storm, I stopped for a stranger. That stranger saved my life just as much as I saved hers. This is a family story about what happens when greed disguises itself as love. When someone sits at your table, smiles at your face, and quietly plans your end. My advice to you is simple. Do not ignore the small signs the way I almost did. Do not let loyalty blind you to the truth. The people who truly love you will never need to diminish you to benefit themselves. This family betrayal nearly broke me, but it also showed me who I really was. I believe that no family is perfect, but family betrayal of this kind, calculated and cold, is something no one should have to survive alone. If this family betrayal looks familiar to you in any way, trust your instincts. Trust your hands. Build something stronger. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe so you never miss another story. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. These stories contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and meaning. If this type of content is not for you, we completely understand, and we warmly invite you to explore other content that speaks to your heart.